Many men believe that intelligence protects them from being controlled by instinct, and this belief is one of the most persistent illusions they carry into adulthood. A man who thinks clearly, analyzes situations, and understands complex systems assumes that his decisions are guided primarily by reason. He trusts his mind to override impulse, emotion, and unconscious reaction. In professional life, this confidence is often justified. Intelligence allows a man to delay gratification, plan long-term, and operate within abstract frameworks that reward discipline and foresight. Over time, this creates the impression that rational awareness equals control. However, instincts do not disappear simply because they are understood. They operate beneath conscious thought, shaping reactions long before logic has a chance to intervene. A man may believe he is choosing freely, while his behavior is quietly guided by impulses related to status, validation, fear of loss, or desire for approval. Intelligence often makes this influence harder to detect, not weaker. The mind becomes skilled at explaining behavior after the fact, constructing logical narratives that justify decisions already made at an instinctive level. This is especially visible in relationships, where attraction, insecurity, jealousy, and attachment activate ancient biological programs that logic was never designed to manage. A man may believe he is acting reasonably, yet repeatedly find himself making choices that contradict his long-term interests. He wonders why awareness does not translate into control. The answer is that understanding instinct is not the same as mastering it. Until a man recognizes that intelligence often serves instinct rather than governs it, he remains vulnerable to patterns he believes he has already outgrown. This realization is uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that insight alone leads to freedom. But without acknowledging the role of instinct, intelligence becomes a sophisticated tool for self-deception rather than self-mastery. One of the reasons instincts are so difficult to recognize is that they rarely announce themselves as impulses. Instead, they disguise themselves as reasonable thoughts. A man does not usually think, "I am acting out of fear," or "I am seeking validation." He thinks, "This makes sense," or "This is the logical choice." His intelligence provides him with explanations that feel coherent and justified, even when the underlying motivation is instinctive. This is why self-awareness alone often fails to produce change. The man becomes aware of patterns, yet continues to repeat them, because awareness does not automatically interrupt instinctual response. In relationships, this dynamic becomes especially visible. A man may rationalize jealousy as concern, control as protection, or emotional reactivity as honesty. Each justification feels reasonable in isolation, but together they reveal a pattern driven by unconscious need rather than conscious choice. The more intelligent the man, the more convincing his justifications become. He can articulate his reasons clearly, argue them persuasively, and even convince others that his behavior is rational. What he often cannot see is that logic is being used after the fact to defend an instinctive reaction that has already shaped his behavior. This creates a false sense of agency. He believes he is choosing, when in reality, he is responding. Over time, this gap between perceived control and actual behavior produces frustration and confusion. The man knows what he should do, yet finds himself doing something else. He understands the pattern, yet feels unable to step outside it. Until he recognizes that instincts do not need permission to operate, and that intelligence often functions as their accomplice rather than their regulator, he remains trapped in a cycle where insight increases explanation, but not freedom. This is why attempts to control instinct through willpower or intellectual discipline usually fail. A man may decide to act differently, set rules for himself, or adopt new beliefs, yet find that under pressure, his behavior reverts to familiar patterns. Instinct does not operate on intention. It operates on perceived threat and opportunity. When a man feels his status challenged, his attachment threatened, or his sense of control weakened, instinct takes over instantly, bypassing conscious decision-making. Intelligence enters only afterward, explaining and justifying the reaction. This creates the illusion that the problem lies in insufficient effort or weak discipline, when in reality the man is fighting a system that does not respond to force. In relationships, this often appears as repeated emotional reactions the man believes he has already worked through. He promises himself to remain calm, detached, or centered, yet finds himself pulled back into the same emotional loops. The mistake is assuming that instinct must be suppressed or overridden. Instinct cannot be eliminated, but it can be redirected. This requires understanding not what instinct is saying, but why it is activated in the first place. A man who constantly reacts emotionally is not lacking intelligence. He is operating from unresolved internal instability. Until that instability is addressed, logic serves only as a commentary, not a guide. True control does not come from resisting instinct, but from reducing the conditions that trigger it. When a man's sense of identity, direction, and self-worth are not dependent on external validation, instinct loses much of its leverage. At that point, intelligence stops defending reactions and begins shaping behavior. Without this shift, a man may become highly self-aware, yet remain fundamentally predictable, repeating the same patterns while believing he has moved beyond them. The key distinction most men never fully grasp is that instincts are not enemies to be defeated, but forces that must be correctly positioned within the internal hierarchy of the self. When a man treats instinct as something irrational that should be suppressed by willpower or intellect, he creates constant internal friction. Suppression requires effort, vigilance, and control, and under pressure, it inevitably fails. The moment stress, uncertainty, or emotional threat appears, instinct bypasses conscious intention and takes command. What actually reduces instinctive control is not resistance, but integration. A man gains leverage over instinct when his life has clear direction, internal coherence, and a stable sense of identity that is not dependent on external validation. In this state, instinct no longer needs to react defensively because there is nothing fragile to protect. His worth is not being negotiated moment by moment, and his sense of self is not threatened by rejection, ambiguity, or emotional distance. This is why men who appear calm under pressure are often misunderstood as unemotional or detached. In reality, they are internally aligned. Their instincts are not fighting against their identity, they are supporting it. In relationships, this alignment produces a fundamental shift. The man no longer reacts to emotional fluctuations with urgency, explanation, or anxiety because his stability does not depend on immediate reassurance. He does not need to suppress desire, jealousy, or fear. He observes them without acting on them automatically. Intelligence finally stops functioning as a defense mechanism and begins operating as guidance. Decisions are made deliberately rather than reactively. Presence replaces justification. Silence becomes an option rather than a threat. This does not mean instinct disappears or becomes irrelevant. Instinct remains active, but it no longer dictates behavior. It becomes a source of information rather than a driver of action. The man feels impulses without being controlled by them, recognizes emotional triggers without being consumed by them, and experiences desire without collapsing into need. This is the difference between awareness and mastery. Awareness allows a man to see patterns. Mastery restructures the conditions that generate those patterns in the first place. Until this shift occurs, intelligence remains vulnerable to instinctive override, endlessly explaining behavior it never truly governed. Once it occurs, instinct falls into its proper role, supporting action rather than controlling it. Only then does rational choice begin to function where it was always assumed to exist, not as an illusion of control, but as a lived reality.